Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to see you today. We're going to be continuing our discussion about Pastor John Macarthur, the article, the report that was written by investigative journalist Julie Royce is raising the questions, and we are going ahead and answering and trying to answer those questions. She wrote an article about Pastor John Macarthur, the respected evangelical pastor of Grace Community Church in California. And the question is, should a pastor of a local church be rich? Or should a pastor of a church, any church, mega church, small church, medium-sized church, should the pastor be a millionaire or a multimillionaire? It raises a lot of different questions, and it's not as easy as one might think. You would think, for example, I'm getting some feedback from different listeners and viewers. I got a message from someone who said that they live in the third world and that a millionaire pastor is a very strange thing in their view. And it would be. We can well imagine someone, say, in Central America. I've been to Central America, some of the countries down there, Honduras. If you were to say that there's a mega millionaire pastor in a Honduras church, that would be so it would be so strange. If you were to say that in some of the other countries I've been to, Guatemala, it would be strange. Also, perhaps not as much as if you had a millionaire pastor in Honduras and so on and so forth. So, and then you could go to Africa and you could look, and there are actually millionaire pastors in Africa, even in some of the very poor countries. So the question stands, but we have to realize that you have to go deeper than just the appearance. Now, in respect to someone like a Pastor John Macarthur, if you look at his life and you look at his teachings, and although we don't know him personally, we don't know what he's like in his private life because he keeps his public ministry life very separate from his private life. For example, I have listened to him. I think I've heard him on radio for at least 30 or 40 years. I've seen him on television many decades. He's on television now. I've seen him in pictures and I've seen him in many places, but I still don't know what his wife looks like. I have never seen him in a conversation with his wife. I've never seen him talking or walking down a sidewalk with his wife. So that kind of gives you the indication that Pastor John Macarthur wants to keep his public life separate from his private life, and we can all understand that. There are reasons why pastors want to do that. But when they do that, and this is very common with megachurch pastors, big church pastors, pastors of churches, I think a megachurch would be 2,000 and above in the United States, and in Europe, a megachurch pastor might be 500 person church and above. But here in the United States, we have mega church pastors, and every state of the union has them. There are thousands of local church pastors that have over 1,000 or 2,000 or up persons in their church. And there are thousands and thousands of pastors who are in probably the most basic standard of measurement, millionaires. When you think of a millionaire, you think of a rich person. Now, I said in the last episode when I was talking about this topic, the millionaire threshold is not as big of a deal today as it once was. And I think one of the things that people have to keep in mind is that when you're looking at a pastor and his salary and his net worth, for example, like Julie Royce did, just because he lives in a home that has a valuation of over $1 million, that in and of itself really doesn't say much about the individual person. It doesn't say that they necessarily have a love for money. It doesn't necessarily mean that they like to own fancy possessions. It doesn't really say much depending on where you live in this country. This economy that we have in the United States, and to some extent the whole Western world, but I'll just focus on the United States. The United States economy is so crazy prosperous, even during the downturns, even during the recession times. Uh, if you're a Californian resident and you bought a small home or even a medium-sized home in California, in or around a major city metropolis like LA, San Diego, San Francisco, if you bought a home in a suburbs of a major city metropolis 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and I know people like this. I know people who live in Cerritos, California, a suburb of Los Angeles. These people bought a home for a normal price, what we would maybe consider normal price for the time, back in the 60s, back in the 70s. They bought the home, I think $25,000. Very typical. You will hear old folks, old people, seniors talk about buying their first home for $15,000. You will even talk about, I think James Dobson was giving a history walk back into his life, and he said that he and his wife bought their first home out there in California. I think it was for $10,000, a brand new home. I'm not a brand new home, but a complete home. What has happened, the economy is so crazy and this country has gotten so prosperous, is that you can take a $10,000 home that you bought 40, 50 years ago, and it's now worth over $1 million. That is a fact. You can go to the economics and look at it in California, and you can verify that. This is not a fabrication. So when you see someone in California who owns a home that is valuation is over $1 million, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that these people are rich. The people in Cerritos, I'm thinking about this elderly couple and their son, who through divorce or some situation is living with them again after decades away. Their home is probably about $1 million. And it's crazy. They are not millionaires. They don't live a lavish lifestyle. They live a typical middle-class lifestyle, but their home is a crazy $1 million valuation. And if they sold their home, yes, they would become what we would consider rich. Another thing that you have to take into and I think Julie Royce has to factor this in, because if you just look at these issues on the surface, you will go, wow, this pastor, he lives in $1 million home. He must be a money lover. He must be led astray by the idol of finances and possessions. And it doesn't have to be that way, and it isn't that way. I will guarantee you that John Macarthur, and the scenario was probably this way, although I don't know it and I can't verify it. And this is why we need transparency. We need people like John Macarthur, who has put himself out there in his teaching ministry. We need them to sit down and talk about these things and be transparent and use it as a teaching opportunity, and have Phil Johnson ask him just basic questions. Things like, how are you going to answer some of these questions by people like Julie Royce, who are saying that because your home is worth over $1 million, you must have some kind of money motivations? I believe what is typical, for example, in these cases like John Macarthur, is that John Macarthur became the pastor of Grace Community Church, 40 years ago, 45 years ago? And he and his wife bought a home, and it wasn't a fancy home. It wasn't super expensive. It wasn't a rich person's home, as you might consider a rich person's home would be. And they and he just went to work and he preached the gospel and he pastored the church decade after decade after decade. The home value, like in all cases out in California, home valuation went up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And lo and behold, after 4 or 5 decades, this man's home is worth over $1 million. That is a very typical scenario. Or it could have been that they bought a home back 40 or 50 years ago, and it was a typical home for a couple and a growing family. And after 20 years, its valuation grew, and so they sold that home and they decided to live in another home. So they bought another home with the money, and then that home went up in value, and lo and behold, they have a home that's worth over $1 million. You just talk to anyone out in California, and that's the scenario that can easily happen, and you don't have to be someone who's greedy and always thinking about money and always thinking about stocks and bonds and your net worth and your bank account and all that stuff. I don't believe John Macarthur does that. I don't believe he's obsessed with the finances of this world. I believe he goes to his office and he puts himself in there and immerses himself in his study, and he gets the text before him and he wrestles with the text. And we know that he puts in, what did he say at one point, like 40 hours a week or 20 to 40 hours a week wrestling with the text and educating himself on all of the comments of the great Bible scholars, and tries to figure out how he's going to present this so that he's preaching the Word of God. And I think he spends his time in the Lord's work. He does not spend his time trying to figure out how he can make the most money, and he's not always spending his time in investments and all this other thing. But that is another point. It is not, believe it or not, again, this economy in the United States, God has so blessed this nation. That is why people from South America and Central America are crashing into our border, our southern border, and are trying to, by the hundreds and thousands, get in here, because our economy is so crazy big and prosperous. You can hear stories all the time. I heard one just the other day, about a janitor who was a secret millionaire. He was worth, I think it was $5 to $8 million, a janitor in a school. He had worked a couple decades, 2 or 3 decades, at a service station, a gas station, pumping gas. And then he was let go from that job. But at the same time, he had they gave him a salary, they gave him pay, and he bought a little home, and he raised a family, and he paid his bills, and he didn't live lavishly, but everybody was thinking, well, this guy's probably just making enough to pay his bills. And then when that job ended, the gas station job, he applied for a janitor job at a local school, and he spent the last 17 years of his life in that. And lo and behold, when he died in his late 80s, he was worth $8 million through his investments. And what he would do is that he would go to the library and he would look up and read books on investing in the stock market, and he would put a little bit aside from every paycheck, and he would invest in some of the major corporations in our country. And lo and behold, those stocks went up, and here's this guy that no one would have believed, but he had earned himself through his investing millions and millions of dollars, and he lived in a humble home, and he dressed in normal clothing, and no one would have known it. That happens quite a bit. There are a lot of millionaires in the United States, not because they are money grubbers and lovers of idols of finance and all that other thing you might imagine. No, they just invested in the right investments, whether it's the stock market or mutual funds, or they invested, somebody talked them into buying gold or silver or whatever the investment was, real estate, and they just grew that into riches. And it's really it's really amazing if you're not in this kind of an economy to imagine that. If you're in a third world nation, if you're in a typical African nation or a typical Latin American nation, it's hard to imagine an economy being that way. But in this country here, the United States, it is possible to do that. But the question is, should church pastors and Christian leaders and local church pastors and leaders, should they get rich even if they can get rich? Should they allow themselves to become multimillionaires or millionaires? Now, if you're a pastor of a church that grows big, say you're a pastor of a church and you start the church and it's like 100 people and then it grows to be a couple thousand or even 5,000 or 6,000. And the way it grows usually is that you get into a building and you get a larger building and so on and so forth, the typical thing. Should you allow your church to give you a large salary every year, even though from a certain perspective, in one sense, you deserve it? Now, some pastors have said, well, I don't make more than a comparable business executive leading a comparable business corporation would make of a comparable size. So, in other words, they're comparing their church with a business entity like a local business. And if the local business if he were managing a budget of $10 million a year, the CEO would receive a salary of X amount. And some pastors make this argument, well, I'm not making any more or any less than a typical manager at a business would make if you made $10 million a year in your business. Well, the problem with that is the church is not a for-profit business. It's not a money-making entity. So that argument only applies businesses to businesses. You can make that argument if you're a businessman and your church or your business is growing and you're trying to figure out what would be an appropriate salary for the CEO, and you look around at the other businesses and you see that they're making about this much. And so you would say, well, I'm not making any more or less than the other CEOs and corporate heads would make at this level of development. Okay, that argument makes sense, but it doesn't make sense in a local church because you're not a profit-making entity. And so don't compare yourself to the corporate world. And that's where a lot of pastors get into trouble. That's where a lot of pastors fail because they're trying to make a comparison, apples and oranges. The church is not a business. The church is not a business entity. Yes, there are organizational issues that come up in the church. You have financial issues that come up in the church, and you need to have someone at the church, hopefully someone in your church that knows how to balance the books and bookkeeping and data entry and able to manage a budget. Yes, but even though the church has finances, it's not a financial institution and it's not a business for profit. Even though the church has staffing issues, it's not a corporation where you would have like a human resources department and so forth. It's a different thing altogether, or it should be. Now, maybe one of the problems is a lot of churches, and especially large churches, they're trying to run their church as if it is a business entity, and that is what probably gets a lot of pastors and churches into trouble. But in the case of John Macarthur, I can well imagine that he simply faithfully preached the gospel, and he took opportunities to expand his gospel preaching whenever they were possible. So when there was a radio station open, he applied to preach the gospel for a half an hour on the radio station, and then there were more opportunities in the radio stations, and he expanded that. And so the worldwide outreach, I think it's Grace to You now, reaches into all kinds of nations. Uh, there doesn't have to be any kind of sinful motivation attached to what happened to Grace to You ministry or the Grace Community Church. And so we should look at these situations case by case. Again, I think it would be healthy and wise if Pastor John Macarthur were to sit down with someone like a Phil Johnson and say, let's talk about this, because I want to help pastors negotiate through this issue about what to do if your church grows or expands or the budget increases and the board of elders and the council at your church or whatever your government structure, they want to compensate you. And it's typically the case where a pastor or anyone actually working in any field would normally have a slight pay increase if things are going well every year. Well, what about the situation where if the church keeps increasing the pastor's salary every year, that over time he becomes a very well-paid pastor, and he actually is making quite a bit of money. I'm talking about, in the six figures. And to me, it seems to me that the scripture would warn against someone, you can actually make too much money. You can actually own too many possessions. You can actually then be led astray by these idols of wealth. And so there needs to be accountability. There needs to be someone in the church, someone on the board. There needs to be a discussion, okay, how much are we going to pay our pastor, and what are the limits we're going to pay our pastor? And the pastor should also be on board with that whole discussion and say, yeah, I appreciate the pay that my church is giving me, and they're trying to help me and make it as easy as I can to keep on doing what I'm doing here and preaching the word and pastoring and providing leadership. But the issue is there a cap that needs to be set? Do the men of God need to look at the whole picture and step back and say, now, wait a minute, I'm not in this for the money. So I don't need to have a salary increase every year as if I'm some worldly corporate executive. I don't need to have bonuses given to me like they do in the secular corporate world, the financial world. I don't need to follow the example of for-profit companies or even non-profit companies. There's a whole big sector of our economy that is the nonprofit organizations. And that nonprofit organizations does not mean that these executives don't get a lot of money. It just means that at the end of the year, these corporations do not carry a profit. Their motivation is not profit, but that doesn't mean that the CEO doesn't make a ton of money. And some of these charities, for example, actually the CEO is a millionaire and makes $1 million salary. So I think pastors and churches need to rethink a lot of this and say, look, we are not going to encourage our church leaders and our staff pastors and staff members. We're not going to encourage them to accumulate wealth. Even if things are going well, we're going to have that discussion with them about putting limitations or being self-disciplined and saying, look, what does Paul say? I am content with what I have. If I have food and drink, I am content. There's a biblical principle about saying, okay, this is enough. There's also Old Testament precedent in the accounts in Exodus where Moses was told by God to have the people bring their precious metals or the valuable items that they had of gold and silver bring that and offer it as a gift. And so the people were bringing their precious metal objects to be melted down for the construction of the ark and other instruments within the tabernacle. And there came a point where there was enough to do the job, and the Lord instructed Moses, okay, tell the people to don't come and don't give anymore. And so there was a limitation. There was a level of giving that was met, and that was enough. And I think that same principle needs to apply in cases where the Lord has blessed a local church or blessed a ministry. This would also apply to ministries as well. We learned about, for example, the Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias. He had a multi-million-dollar ministry, and the ministry had a multi-million-dollar budget. And Ravi was a millionaire. The same principles apply to Christian ministers that are not local church pastors as it does to the local church pastors. There needs to be self-control on the part of the pastor and on the board and the church. There needs to be limits set and saying, look, we want to pay our pastor a comfortable salary, but we don't want to necessarily make him rich. We don't want to give him money to the point where he might be distracted by that wealth or tempted by that wealth. You know, we have plenty of warnings from Jesus himself, for example, how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. That should send us warnings. And it should definitely, and with no doubt, pastors should know about those passages and grapple with those passages. So we shouldn't judge the pastors that are well paid, but again, we need to look deeper and find out, do they have limits? Have they self-disciplined themselves and controlled themselves to the point where they are not being led astray by money? I think, for example, Pastor John Macarthur, I've said it again, I'll say it again, needs to sit down and have an open, frank, transparent, honest conversation on this topic, maybe even a teaching, and explain his own philosophy of how to deal with living in a prosperous United States and living with the growing church and an expanding church budget, and how does he keep his own perspective on this without getting carried away and accumulating too much money and accumulating too many possessions, and how does he deal with the materialism and prosperity of our culture and society? Well, we would like to hear that conversation. I think we need to have that conversation now, after especially the investigative reporting by Julie Royce and raising these issues. So I hope that this conversation can continue. What do you think about this? Leave some comments below, and we'll see you next week on another edition of our program. God bless.